Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome back. Happy Friday. It is Friday and it is time for our plant consciousness commentary. Ooh, I am so excited about today. I have been looking forward to this for the last 2 days. So much to tell you, so much to tell you. Oh, I just got back into town. I went away. I went to the Plant Facts, Plant Facts conference. It was I know this doesn't really say anything. There is a tote bag, but it's way over there, and I don't feel like getting up right now to go get it. But they gave us this little notebook. This is the Mind the Plants lab at the University of Padova in Italy. It is in the Department of Psychology, and Mind the Plants lab is a laboratory that is now doing all sorts of experiments and research into plant cognition, plant psychology, how plants grow from a cognition perspective. It's fascinating. Oh, here we go. Here's the logo, Plant Flax. It's on the back. I didn't even notice it was on the back. So this is the logo of the conference that I just went to. This is the logo of the department. They gave us this really cute notebook as well as a pin and a tote bag. I kind of decided at the last minute that I was actually going to go. These conferences is a type of open conference, 2 days, actually a day and a half, that are based on the funding that this laboratory got. And this is part of their dissemination of the information, their sharing of the information. So they invited in a series of scientists to come and present their work. And I was really excited to be able to go. I didn't think I was going to be able to do it. It's only actually, it's a 2.5-hour train ride, but I have to drive for an hour and a half, almost 2 hours to get to the train station in Milan, and then from Milan to Padova. But it was well worth it. If you're new around here and you're trying to figure out what am I talking about, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Tigria Gardenia. I am a nature-inspired mentor and a certified life coach. And for more than a decade, I have been working closely with plants to share their practical wisdom with you, consciously embody the elements of life that nourish you, your evolution. Kind of the reason why I step into this role is I have a bachelor's degree, actually, in music engineering and electrical engineering. So this is where I started off in the role of plant music and of understanding the music of the plants device, and I'm working closely with the development of that device, actually more of the development of the device to get it ready for the mainstream. And also I have a master's degree in vegetal future with Stefano Mancuso, which is plants, social innovation, and design. I also, as I said, I'm a professional certified coach with a credential from the International Coaching Federation, and I'm the director of Damanhur International. For those of you that don't know what Damanhur is one of the largest spiritual eco communities in the world, which happens to be where I live, and I support initiates worldwide. I also have a kind of strange background, which is why I love doing this, because I'm a former Kabbalah teacher, a current instructor of Method Action and of the Damanhur Academy. I am a Gaia featured expert and an international speaker on plant communication and consciousness for personal development. In 2000, I don't know, what was that, 2020? No, 21, I founded the Naturally Conscious Community, which is a premier online ecosystem to nourish plant reawakening for community support and accelerated evolution and co-creation with other kin. So that kind of sums up pretty much who I am and the reason why I come here with you every Friday to do plant consciousness commentary. And plant consciousness commentary started off as an opportunity for me to share with you the various papers and research that I dive into in order to better understand the plant world and the plant kin home, as I call it, kin home, using ki and kin as the pronouns for plants, ki for singular and kin for plural. And rather than calling it a kingdom, which really is about the dominion of the king, which makes no sense, I prefer to go with kin home. And so there's also an article on my website, tigriagardenia.com/kinship, that will explain to you kin and key and kin, and why it is that I work in this and why I've chosen to use this phrase. So my plant consciousness commentary is an opportunity for us to dive into some of these technical papers, but to break them down in a way that makes sense for everyday life, for personal development, for really deep connection with the plant kin home, to get to know plants in a different way, using the scientific base as an opportunity for you to understand more who are these wonderful beings that we live our lives surrounded by. And all of the previous old, not previous plant consciousness commentaries can be found on my website. Some of them are on YouTube. Some of them are on the Naturally Conscious. Actually, all of them are in the Naturally Conscious community. Some of them are also on YouTube. And so on my website, you can go to tigriagardenia.com/commentary, and you can find all of the previous editions, and depending on where they are, so you can check them out, watch the videos, understand who they are. All that long explanation, because I still don't have a bumper or anything like that I do. Anyways, we're here today. We're ready. We're excited. I'm excited. And the reason I'm excited is because the paper that we're going to go through today is a paper that's been sitting on my list of to do. Now, as you know, I've been going pretty much in alphabetical order. I've been trying to go in alphabetical order. That's not the right word. Chronological order. I've been trying to go in chronological order to give us the history of really the evolution of plant neurobiology and of the kind of slow reawakening that's been happening since about the beginning of the 2000s, 2006, to where we are today. And every once in a while, I jump out of order. But sometimes I also hold a paper because papers can be very technical. Some are opinion pieces, which are much easier to describe and understand, but some of them are pretty technical. And understanding the technical and how it can relate to day-to-day life sometimes takes a leap. It also even just takes a leap for me, in part because I first have to understand what it was that the researcher was trying to get to. Then I have to think about, and I do a lot of internal research, like with myself, as well as with my plant partners and all the different partners that work with me, to try to understand what is it about what I just read, or what is it about the discovery of this paper that can be most useful for our personal evolution. Because obviously, from a research perspective, the researchers are just excited that they're discovering all these really cool things that plants do. And that is one aspect of it. But for it to be useful for our purposes, we also want to understand, how is it that whatever it is that the plants are doing can be applied to an understanding of who we are today and what it is that we're doing today. So with that in mind, actually, hold on a second. I just realized something. I can't do that. Okay. I was hoping that oh, here we go. Maybe this will give me, exciting. Sorry. I just discovered that on, um, I never changed on the description. I try to get better about not just leaving a generic description on YouTube when I start the broadcast, like when I know already what paper I'm going to go to. But this time I didn't do that. So I don't think this is going to be any better, because the title of the paper that we're going to go to is pretty technical, which is exactly what I want to explain, why it was that I was holding this paper. Because this paper, as you know, if you've been watching, we're about in the year 2021, 2022. We're heading into 2022 in relation to where some of the papers are. This paper is from 2019. It was actually written in 2018, but it was actually published in January of 2019. And I held this paper for a while because it's one of those more technical papers. And I wasn't sure. Why are you trying to schedule it? I tried to change the thing because it says edit, and I don't want it, and it's not letting me do this. The stream is already live, so I can't edit it. All right, so oh well, that's what it is. This is what's going to happen. And so anyway, I held this paper because it is a kind of more technical paper. More importantly, the concepts. I was trying to figure out exactly where the concepts would fit into the work that we're doing and understanding it from the perspective of our own development. And lo and behold, now I really understand. This is why you have to trust yourself. You have to trust your instincts and trust what's coming up. Now I know why I held it. So, as I said, I went to this conference, Plant Facts, over the last 2 days. It was Wednesday and Thursday in Padua, and presenting were some of the researchers that I have been studying for a while, including František, I can never say his first name, Baluška, who we've read and we've reviewed many of his papers. Baluška is definitely one of those people that's pushing hard for plants to be recognized as conscious beings, as cognitive beings. He and Stefano Mancuso, who was my professor, are kind of the instrumental, fundamental founders of the Plant Neurobiology Society, which eventually became the Plant Signaling and Behavior Society, also with Elizabeth van Valkenburg. And Elizabeth van Valkenburg was also there. And that was exciting because she has now retired. She taught at the University of Washington in the United States. Baluška is from the University of Bonn. And I was really excited to get to meet her. We ended up having lovely, lovely, lovely conversations because we seem to be on the same page in so many ways. And it was just a wonderful opportunity to get to hear some of these papers being presented. Many of these papers that were presented are actually papers that we have looked at, that we have gone through. And they are, if not, they are some that are on my list. Some of them were extremely, extremely technical, but I was glad to be able to hear the description directly from the researcher and from understanding exactly what it is they're doing. Also, I was able to pose a few questions, really one that stumped everybody, because of course I'm approaching it differently than most of them are, because most of them are approaching it from a very academic perspective. And as much as they are studying plants as cognitive beings, they still somewhat think of plants as objects, especially James Cahill, who is another one of my favorite researchers. I love the work that Cahill has done, but at the same time, Cahill was very adamant, like very honest in his presentation and the answer to my question, which is that, he likes working with plants because there are no restrictions, different than, for example, animal ethics that already exist. And so therefore he can kind of do whatever the hell he wants. So as much as he's sort of inadvertently proving cognition, they're still treating plants as objects in order to prove that they're cognitive beings. It's this dichotomy that I think is going to exist for a while. It's kind of scary, and academics don't want to get into this conversation. And this is the type of conversation that we have all the time in the naturally conscious community about how scary it is for many people to understand that the more we get to the understanding that plants are conscious beings, not just sentient in the perspective of I can somewhat feel and I am somewhat alive, but actually conscious means that we will have to change the way we interact with them. And at the same time, we have to be really careful because, for example, Baluška's research, sometimes he pushes towards the preference of kind of Darwinism, where we think of the root tips, the roots of plants as their brains. But the minute that we invert the human by putting the head underground and think of the plants as having the brain underground, we sort of still apply human type thinking and human descriptions for plants. And this is something that Elizabeth van Valkenburg is like really pushing us to not do. Yes, we want to understand plants. Yes, like we did last week's paper where we talked about the extension and the broadening of the definition of a nervous system. It is to understand these types of systems and biological systems that plants have, and probably moving towards cognitions and consciousness and thinking and memory and all these pieces. But at the same time, it's extremely important for us to understand. And there was a little bit of a tiff at the very end around semantics and definitions. It's extremely important for us to understand that plants are not human, and we should not think of plants as human. We can think of plants as conscious beings. We can think of plants as thinking even, and as having an emotional and an inner consciousness. But it's important to not think of them as humans because kin are very, very different. And that gives us an opportunity to enter into a different type of relationship. And it's dangerous for us to think of them as humans because while we want to give plants rights and think of plants as important beings that have their own agency, it is different than some of the rules that we've created for humans because plants are not humans. They don't have the same relationship with death that we do. They don't have the same system and body and the same limitations that we as humans have. And so therefore, it is much more important for us to enter into our connection with plants, not as other forms of humanoids. And this is part of the danger that is happening as we try to describe things because all we have is human definitions. And this is why in the naturally conscious community and in the work that I do, you'll see over and over again why I use the arts, why I use more esoteric means at times for our understandings, for our deep feeling of what exactly it means to be a plant so that we do not get caught up in the perspective of what exactly is a plant in a human term. It's complicated, but it's fun and it's interesting and it's allowing us to enter into a relationship with these beings in a whole different way. So why was I so excited today was because one of the papers that I had been holding back on doing out of order, I couldn't figure out why because I kept reading it and saying, I understand what this paper is, kind of, but there's a limit and I wasn't ready to do it. And now I understand why, because the last speaker was the author of this paper, which is Gustavo Souza. Now, Gustavo Souza was fascinating throughout the entire conference. He was sitting there and you could just tell he's a character. He's definitely a character. He's a Brazilian plant physiologist who enters into this space really approaching originally plants as a physiologist, plant looking at how the physiology of the plant develops. And yet he was very adamant at the beginning and ended up getting into a fight with one of the other professors who I'm not going to say his name because he's a professor out of Turin who was working more with the interface between plants and fungi, who got very offended at the fact that Gustavo Souza is approaching this entire conversation from the perspective that we have to get away from mechanistic science and get into a different form of science that allows us to understand who plants are as the plant beings that they are. So thinking of plants as modular, thinking of attention using different definitions than just the traditional definitions that we've been using, and more importantly, getting away from trying to understand just the mechanistic principles of one individual little piece and more looking at it, not just systemic, but looking at it from a whole systems sort of approach. So I really appreciated his enthusiasm, his excitement, and his ability to kind of want to look outside the box. We've already done one of his papers before. If you go back, you'll see that there's a paper called Extended Cognition in Plants. Is it possible? We did this back in May of 2023. So we did this a while back was when we did this paper. And this really was a paper that was a fascinating breakdown of the different ways of looking at plant cognition. So looking at different forms of extended cognition in, for example, spiders and in cephalopods, so in cuttlefish and in different kinds, and in octopi and other things, where Parisi Galliano and Souza got together and they were looking at different organisms and understanding what cognition. And so this paper was a bit technical, but I think we found a good way to understand it and to look at this as a path towards understanding cognition better and expanding the definition of cognition better. So in this particular paper, this paper that we're going to go to, let me just put it up on the screen so that we can see it. Actually, I'm going to use this view. So here we're going to look at plants as electromic plastic interfaces, a mesological approach. Now, as you can tell already by the name is not like super easy. I have my trusty dusty notes that I took from when Souza was presenting this to everyone, because His overall talk was around should modular systems like plants pay attention? So glimpses from plant electrome analysis. So let me explain what he's trying to say is one of the conversation pieces around the idea of cognition is attention. Attention is if you think about the perspective of even just using for a second your own human perspective is if we were to think of plants as giant antennas, antennas are I can't ever think of another word. I try to think of the word stupid because stupid means just unintelligent. In other words, an antenna just takes in signals, and then those signals get filtered when they come in. But human beings, we do something else. We selectively decide what we're going to pay attention to. So I might be talking with a friend in a super noisy cafe, and I can perfectly hear my friend because I selectively give my attention to that friend, and therefore I can just forget about the rest. So part of my consciousness is to consciously choose where to put my attention. And the question that Gustavo Souza was looking at is, are plants doing the same thing? In other words, is one of the way towards to understand the overall cognition in plants is to move towards the concept that plants can selectively choose how to give attention. And as part of that, the question is, what is the mechanism by which they give attention? So we humans know that we use the brain, right? We have these different aspects of the brain that can pay attention to different stimuli around us. And so in that way, I am able to use this piece of myself. So my brain, to a certain extent, is modular, but it's still mostly, at least from what we understand today, although there are those that argue that it's not all in the brain. But for now, let's just go with it, that it's all concentrated in. So instead, Souza, because I'm going to quote Martyr a second because Souza quoted Martyr, is looking at, could it be that the electrophysiological system of the plants, in other words, the way plants use electrical responses, be what is used for cognition or for attention, for paying attention? And so first and foremost, let's define what attention is. And in this particular case, Souza pulls on Michael Martyr, who we've talked about so many times, right? The psychologist working in the concept of plant intelligence and plant consciousness says he uses the definition of attention that says disproportionate investment of physical or mental energy by an organism, tissue, or cell into a particular activity or into the reception of a singled out stimulus or set of stimuli. Okay. So for Martyr's definition, and in this case, Souza, who's accepting that, is saying that giving attention means when I invest physical or mental energy. In the case of humans, we think of mental from the perspective of the brain, but mental just means thought process, which from the perspective of plants could be many different aspects. And that's still what we're studying and trying to understand by either an organism, a tissue, or even a cell, right? So we're not necessarily going to just the brain. We're going to, or just what I see outside of myself, or what I as an entire being pay attention to. It could be something that my cells are paying attention to, that my tissue is paying attention to. And when I give particular attention to a specific activity or the reception of a singled out stimuli or set of stimulus or set of stimuli, that is what is attention. Now, what Souza is trying to get to is, how do plants do this? And are they doing it? Because again, remember, we're trying to understand cognition. So he's saying, oh, what if it's the electrophysiological interface of plants that allows them to give attention? And this is the direction of what today we think of where we're going with cognition. In other words, we're going to find cognition by better studying the electrophysiological responses of plants, which corresponds a little bit to the big debate that's happening around neurobiology and whether or not plants have a somewhat analogous neurobiological system, which connects to the paper that we talked about last week in broadening the definition of a nervous system so that the nervous system doesn't have to be this physiological piece that has been defined for humans or for animals, but it is a type of mechanism, a type of a what instead of a how. And that is what is going to take us towards. Because remember, everything we're trying to do right now, or this scientific world, there's a piece that is trying to understand, are plants cognizant? Are plants, I'm not even going to get to the word conscious. Let's not even touch that word yet, because that's just a massive debate and it just requires a lot of back and forth that right now is annoying. Let's just get to cognizant. So for the purposes of what we're talking about the electrome, right? Which is the whole electrical activity or signaling inside of a cell, right? The electrical profile of the cell. Wow, all of this, as I'm talking about it here, as much as I'm super excited about it, I realize that it's extremely technical, and I'm trying to figure out how can I explain to you whether or not this is important or how it's important. And it really is important from the perspective of understanding that what we're trying to do is better understand how plants think. And by better understanding how plants think, I'm going to extract it for our purposes. For what we do here is once we understand how plants think, we can better understand our own thinking. Because right now, our thinking is very limited based on our conditioning, based on our human conditioning and the way that human society has sort of controlled how it is that we think about thinking and our own experiences. And so therefore, our authentic selves are lost to a certain extent. We don't understand our bodies well enough, and our bodies are defined by very limited processes. Because if anything, what is coming out from this big argument and discussion that's happening between human neurobiologists and plant neurobiologists, or animal neurobiologists and plant neurobiologists, is the fact that by limiting the way that we think about plants, we actually are limiting ourselves. If we say that all conscious thought has to pass through the brain, that means we are saying that about ourselves. And therefore, us as humans, we are completely limiting the way that we see ourselves. We're limiting ourselves to simply just being what is this brain function right here. And we're not taking into consideration the idea that our body has other aspects that are cognizant. And therefore, if I truly want to know myself and I want to be able to have authentic experiences, I need to go beyond just thinking about the brain. So this is where working with plants closely and getting outside of our human way of thinking can really bring us back into our own humanity in an expanded sense. We can start to understand that there's other parts of ourselves, more senses, more ways of looking at the world, better understandings, and it'll help us understand why sometimes we feel so out of sync with what's happening around us, even though we might be following society's models. Of course, we can't feel in our own skin. How can we when we don't know who exactly we are? Okay. So that being said, we're going to get into today's paper. Today's paper is again going to be probably one of those papers that we might skip around a little bit just because it's going to have some really technical pieces to it, but who knows? We'll get into it and then we'll see what happens. Okay. So here's where we are. There's a lot there. There's a lot. I just spilled tea all over myself. Isn't that beautiful? It happens, I get excited. I get all jumpy. It's what it is. Anyway, I'll deal with it later. Okay, everyone. Here's where we're going. Let's go into, all right. In this manuscript, I like how they call it a manuscript. That already says something. In this manuscript, I just made it really big on my screen, which is awesome because it's exactly what I needed. In this manuscript, we propose that plants are ecoplastic and electromic interfaces that can drive emergent intelligent behaviors. That word emergent is important. Hold on to that word, because emergence is another piece of this, right? Emergent means things that emerge, things that come out of, not necessarily scripted or prescribed different behaviors. So emergent, from synchronized electrical networks. Behind the semantic and anthropocentric problems related by many authors to the extensive use of the terms cognition, intelligence, and even consciousness for plants, we suggest a more pragmatic perspective, considering the vegetal world to be a complex biosystemic entity that is able to co-build the world or a form of the world or of significant reality via a set of reciprocal, emerging, confluent interactions. Speaking of adaptive sensory modalities involving perceptual binding or a global state of receptivity nonlinearly leading to cognitive functions, learning capabilities, and intelligent behaviors of plants seem to be the more realistic and operational model to describe how plants perceive and treat environmental data. In this study, we strongly suggest that the electrome, which mainly involves constant, spontaneous emission of low voltage potentials, is an early marker and a unifying factor of a whole plant reactivity in a constantly changing environment, and is therefore the key to understanding the cognitive nature of plants. This dynamic coupling enables plants to be knowledge accumulating systems that are used by evolution to progress and survive. While mesological plasticity is a unique means for plants to interact as subjects within their milieu or natural habitat and to co-signify a possible world. So all of this, remember, is what I'm saying in that perspective of we want to look at how it is that plants approach cognition. In the case of we, I'm talking about here, you and I, right? Why is it that we're trying to find this in important? Not just for us to understand how amazing our plant friends are, right? To better understand how it is that our plant friends think and experience the world, but also to look at that and say, wow, it's kind of like when you meet somebody who is super smart on some specific topic, and the more you hang out with that person, the more you start to understand and see that topic through that person's eyes. This is the same thing. By understanding and connecting deeply with our plant friends, by communicating with them, but yet also understanding who it is that they are, how it is that they think, we can expand our own thought process. Introduction. To survive, plants are sessile and modular organisms that need to perceive their constantly changing surroundings, literally all of the time, interacting with changes from subtle to potentially disrupting situations on different scales of time, from fractions of seconds to many days. Thus, coupling with the environment in real time is an essential ability for the maintenance of plant stability in a challenging world. The dynamic coupling between the plant and environment in engendering phenotypic changes, i.e. plasticity, in other words, being able to change with the environment on different scales of space-time, is the object of study in both system ecophysiology and mesology approaches. In fact, system ecophysiology and mesology share similar epistemological and methodological bases, and this manuscript could be the first formal meeting between them. The need to readily respond to and integrate external factor fluctuations within the modular structure, an ecoplastic interface, is why plants evolved paths for the transmission of electrical signals. In addition to the plethora of well-known chemical signals, different environmental cues might induce electrical signals in a continuous way throughout the symplast and or apoplast, allowing local to long-distance communication, integrating different signals in the plant body, regardless of the existence of any type of central information processing. To date, different kinds of electrical signal propagation have been reported in the plant realm. such as membrane or cell surface potentials, action potentials, variation potentials, and local electric potentials. By the way, a lot of the potentials part we talked about last week, so you can go into broadening the definition of a nervous system to understand potentials better. All of which are electrical activities involving ion imbalances across plasma membranes, leading to a voltage transient with a phase of fast depolarization of a cell membrane, followed by a phase with variables of repolarization depending on the electrical signal induced. Additionally, Zimmerman et al. Reported a different electrical signal named the systemic potential, which was induced after leaf wounding, characterized by a hyperpolarization of the apoplast instead of a depolarization. However, in addition to those well-known induced electrical signals, a non-evoked low-voltage baseline electrical activity has been recorded at the level of plant tissues. In addition to the evoked signals carrying information throughout the plant body, plant cells might be seen as electrical systems as a whole. Recently, Souza et al. Have proposed the concept of plant electrome, and this is what I was talking about. The electrome is the whole electrical activity, and what they're proposing is that this electrical activity is how we show or how plants set and choose where to give attention. So that attention is this plant electrome is the mechanism that plants use for attention, based on the general proposition of a self-generated electron by Deleuze, describing the totality of ionic dynamics in different scales of plant organization, engendering a constant electrical activity. The electrome of the cells is the consequence of the movement of electrically charged species and the electrical fields generated by these charge flows. In plant cells, the ionic flows are predominantly constituted of such ions, and it goes listing, which are translocated from one side or to the other of the membranes. I told you this paper would have its elements of being too technical, and that's why I'm so glad that I held on to it for a while, because I was trying to figure out why I held on to it for a while, and now I know. It's because I wanted to make sure that something about me knew that I was going to get better information to understand it, to explain it to you in a way that makes sense, because this is going to have a lot of really technical pieces. Okay, so let's keep going. Moreover, in plants, numerous polymers and other macromolecules are immobile and electrically charged, both inside and outside the cells. These immobile charged molecules are generally surrounded by an aqueous phase containing small mobile ions that generates an electrical potential between them, which is known as the Debono potential. At equilibrium, this potential can be calculated by Nernst equation. Do you know the Nernst equation? I don't. The difference in electrical potential between two locations is a measure of the amount of electrical work involved in moving a charge from one place to another. Electrical potential variations are very important for many physiological and cellular processes that are essential for life, as they accomplish work, in addition to signaling purposes. Generally, protons have the major contribution to electrical potentials across plant cell membranes when active ion transport occurs. When ionic active transport has no charge compensation, the process is called electrogenic. In fact, in many plant cells, the electrogenic process is based on hydrogen pumping by the different ATP passes. These protein complexes, together with other ion pumps, are the main players in the generation of electrical potential differences across the plant cell membranes. Can I tell you this? Here's something I'm going to say. When I got my degree, which, like I said, is in music engineering and electrical engineering, never once did I think that I would be applying my electrical experience to this kind of human biology work. And I wouldn't have even thought about it up until the fact that I started to work with the Music of the Plants device, because there I got to sort of apply my perspective on electrical engineering, right? Because the device itself is an electrical device and it's a musical device, which goes specifically to what I studied and what I worked on in the different projects that I worked. And then kind of understand that the electrical signals that are being fed into this device are coming from biological systems, which meant learning about how electrical systems work in plants and in biology, which I have to say I'm still not 100% of an expert in. I mean, with every paper, with every experience, I get to learn more, I get to understand more. It is a lot of learning pieces that I, still have to understand. But what I love is this is a great example of how multi-potentialites work. Multi-potentialites, multi-passionate people like myself, like hopefully you, we have a lot of interest. We have a lot of different concepts that we're trying to understand and that we really we are interested in and that we want to work with and such. And I love the fact that what we get to do is take the general concepts that we learn about and apply them across different sectors, different departments, different areas, different fields. And this is exactly the essence. This is what I love. I love working with my clients on. I love when I'm working with somebody who's talking to me about how they either studied or have a certification in or have worked in a field, but now they're really passionate about this over here. And we can find the string that connects these two. Right? What is it that ties these two together in order to make it something that you want to work with? And this is the heart of what we're talking about right now. So, but that being said, I am going to, like I said, a little bit jump around here because I want to make sure that we get into the areas that we can really understand. So let's see where we are. Therefore, the electrical dimension of plant life is based on the extensive non-evoked electrical activity, as well as the evoked electrical signals, engendering a protoneural system that supports many plant metabolic processes and behaviors. To access the plant electrome, right? When we talk about the electrome, we're talking about the whole electrical signaling of the plant. The electrophytographic technique has been used by measuring the low voltage electrical activity. Souza et al. Showed that different environmental stimuli could alter some characteristics of the temporal dynamics of the plant electrome, including the level of complexity, rather than pure random noise. It was noticed that some specific frequencies which were observed in non-stimulated plants disappeared after stimulation, largely maintaining the lowest frequencies that could support low energy cost, long distance signaling. Okay, let's see where we're getting to, because this is the thing. Normally, I would have jumped all the way to the conclusion first, and then I would come back to see what areas are important to understand this paper. Most of the time when we do our reading here, I read through it because our papers that we're choosing are opinion pieces or papers that are a little easier to understand. When they have something like this, which is obviously very tied into being somebody who understands plant electrophysiology, we have to do a little bit of interpretation and a little bit of jumping around. So basically what he's saying here is, like he says, such permanent and dynamic electrical activity is supposed to be a suitable substrate for plant sentience and cognitive processes. Let's understand this. What he is trying to say is that this electrical type of activity, which is the electrophytographic technique that reads through, that understands the plant electrome, right? All the electrical signaling could be a substrate in the perspective of the mechanism for plant sentience and cognition processes, which means we can understand that if we see this type of activity, it must mean plants have cognition and that there is, for lack of a better term, thinking happening. Because that's one of the difficulties. Plants being different from humans, where humans or even some kind of animals can express something that gives you the impression that there is some thinking going on. In the case of plants, it's not so easy to understand whether or not that thinking is happening. Okay, so that's really what's happening. In this study, cognition is considered in general basis as the dynamic process of the plant-environment relationship, in which plants perceive environmental cues and adjust their behavior by means of actions, affording survival and simultaneously altering the milieu to create an endless feedback of behaviors. So that's what cognition is, which, basically is thinking. I take in a stimuli, I then process it somehow, and I adjust my behavior. And therefore I create behaviors from that. In the next sections, we will explore the implications of the electrical dimensions of plants for the emergent plant cognition capacities, as well as offering an epistemological and ontological framework for a mesological approach of plants as electromic interfaces. So let's talk about the implications of plant cognition and intelligent behaviors. Okay, what are the implications of the unit ensured by the electrome, remember the whole electrical system, in terms of plant cognition, memory, and emerging intelligent behavior? Emerging. The reason I emphasize this word emerging is because one of the arguments that's done by the human and the animal neurobiology is that plant behavior is prescribed. In other words, trigger these stimuli and you get this response. Emerging means no, you can't actually predict it. Sure, you can predict some little things, kind of like I can predict it for a human, but it emerges based on what happens, the processing of it, and then the plant makes a decision and merges with it. Within the post-cognitivist paradigm, plants can be considered as dynamic embodied cognitive structures that are inextricably grounded in an environment in which they can express local or associative but not mental representations, resulting in the implementation of a direct action on this environment. These local associations, together with the plastic and protoneural organization of plants, could have led to activation of the perception action loop and to the development of complex deference or communication strategies, defining the intelligent behavior and cognitive nature of plants. Before discussing these points, one main question ought to be answered by plant cognitivists concerning the apparent contradiction between, on the one hand, the sessile, modular, and iterative constitution of plants, and on the other hand, their complex unitary behaviors, including self-recognition, interspecies communication, and decision-making processes. I still hate that we're still at a place where decision-making is in. Actually, if there's anything I learned from this conference, this conference that I went to, is that, man, the academic world still struggles with accepting certain terminology. I mean, even amongst themselves, even those that carry out the studies and believe it still have to hold themselves back in the way that they speak. It's really kind of sad. To answer this question, we suggest the following. One, that plants are plastic interfaces mediated by an electrum, means they can change. And two, the electrome could play a major role in perception, learning, memory, and cognitive processes by ensuring a continuum of action and a range of behaviors in response to environmental cues at all scales of plant organization. And this is really the heart of what Souza's trying to get to, is that there is the electrome, all of this signaling is really the heart of how plants do all these different things. This is where, so even though, yes, communication can happen through chemical means and there could be all these other things, the way that the plants give attention to specific areas and perceive those areas come through the plant body by electrical signaling, which can be very fast and very, very efficient, even across larger distances when we're talking about large plants like trees or large bushes and such. So that electrical response is way faster and much more reliable than, for example, chemical signatures, which have to go through the air and are not as direct. Electromediation and plasticity complexes. Prior to the consideration of the electrome as a unitary vector, a first point to consider is that plants can be addressed as plastic interfaces in close interrelation with a given environment and a singular milieu or unwelt, and should be studied within the framework of an epistemic concept of plasticity. These plastic interfaces reflecting the perceptual systems of plants are mainly electromediated or expressed by their bioelectrical dimension. Indeed, plants behaving as plastic interfaces or environmental biosensors are able to detect transitional states between perception and the response to stimuli. It can, in turn, provide a theoretical model of evolutionary processes involving phenotypic, epigenetic, and biosemantic plasticity. The epistemic concept of plasticity is a new epistemological paradigm that presents the plasticogenesis, don't you love that word, of all structured systems based on the universal use of plasticity as a fundamental property of the matter energy able to irreversibly link two irreducible dimensions to each other, like subject object or brain mind interfaces. The active binding between PIs form plasticity complexes, inducing co-inherent and co-implied processes, which are metaplastic and transversal in nature. Transposed to plants, this epistemic model could signify the operability and efficiency of modular complex plastic system bonding or actively perception of their surrounding environment, followed by the emergence of some primary processes of cognition or first-person self-experience of the world's raw data, defined by Gibson as ecoperspective, and anotic consciousness. Although speculative, this last hypothesis deserves to be retained insofar as plants are unambiguously able to perceive and interpret many stimuli, to memorize and to learn, maintaining interspecies communication strategies that are both cooperative or competitive. Moreover, inasmuch as the active and reciprocal linkage or bond has been irreversibly installed by PCs, plants are able, as sensitive living systems, to associative learned behaviors. This learning is more than an algorithmic operation consisting of an accumulation of data giving rise to apparent adapted responses. For us, this learning is an act that co-signifies or co-constructs the plant's world, or typically an electroplastic outer experience, giving birth through a form of perceptual binding or learning to cognitive systems and an objective form of reality. Are you following along? There's a lot here already. I'm trying to think about what makes sense for us to read through, because this, again, is very technical, and it is. And of course, I'm always giving you the links so that you can find and read the paper yourself from the perspective of really getting into the nitty-gritty details. So basically where we're trying to get to is in this next section, the electrome as a critically self-organized system, significance of the constant spontaneous emissions of low voltage percept. So here he's going to get into the plant electrome, so the plant's electrical activity and signaling system, how the plant signals using this electrical system, and the complexity of what this means and what it can mean from the perspective of cognition. And that's why I'm kind of going to jump into this, right? Because there are some parts of it that make sense. For example, if the signatures make sense for us to read in the sense of if the signature is assumed to cover the entire bioelectrical spectrum of an embodied cognitive plant structure in its local and global environment, we could hypothesize that the 450 million years of plant dynamic proto-neural organization during evolution have probably determined or pre-built the conditions for the emergence of future animal neural structures. This is an important line, because it's tied into what I keep saying, which is, remember, I keep telling you, the more we understand the plant structures, the more we understand the base foundation of our own structures, because plants have evolved. They were here before us. And as said by this line, right? We can hypothesize that the 400 million years of plant dynamic proto-neural organization during evolution have probably determined or pre-built the conditions for the emergence of future animal neural structures. In other words, it is thanks to that base foundation that our neural structures will able to emerge. So this kind of says that when we go and we look at this electricity as the main messenger system, we can better understand the sort of early parts of our own emergence, of what emerged in our own systems, and go back to kind of the common denominator to then see how is it that plants took this and moved this forward. So this is why it is important to understand that we are all living systems that are nested one between the other, and that yes, we have evolved individually and independently, but we have common ancestors. And also, as we know in nature, nature has a tendency to evolve through different channels, similar functions, because those functions are necessary overall in the world. So when we understand the different ways that these different functions have evolved, we better understand ourselves. Let's see. In other terms, we suggest that the electrome, the electrical activity, could be the key to understanding the cognitive nature of plants by attributing to its perceptual nature a continuity or unitarity that overcomes its organic modularity. This assumption has two implications. One, the consideration of plants as conducting organs that are able to coordinate their physiological activities by means of electrical excitations and transmissions, and to integrate the perception action loop in all their behaviors without necessarily having recourse to a central nervous system. I would define, going back to the paper we just read, I would say without having a central nervous system that looks the way our human or animal nervous system looks like. But in other words, carries out those functions without having to have the same mechanism. The consideration of the evolutionary plan and the plant's use of common receptor gene superfamilies from bacteria to humans, integrating previous genetic processes that become faster and more specialized, but above all, more differentiated. This differentiation does not always indicate a complexification and can, in some species, indicate a more quantitative than qualitative complexity. Following a comparative analysis of self-organized living systems during evolution, plants versus animals were early classified as non-cognitive entities, i.e., lacking representational contents, but having a rich receptive field, in comparison to vertebrate brain development. Within this framework, plant capacities were considered to be outer-directed perceptive states without representational contents, and constituting a discontinuous bridge linking primitive perceptions to future divergent animal conscious constructions. The idea was to focus on unnecessary bottom-up investigation of the levels of perception and cognition in both plants and animals during evolution. Indeed, the growth of complexity was described as not being a single exponential process. And in this transdisciplinary paper, and local divergence of kingdoms were supposed to underlie a global convergence of expression. This position has evolved following our signaling and behavior positioning and considering at least plants as pre-cognitive structures integrating dynamic and knowledge, accumulating perceptive subsystems or PIs. So here we are trying to get to the point where they're trying to very slowly, one step at a time, add the elements to build up to the understanding of cognition. Now, listening to Souza yesterday, just Souza. Gustavo Souza, just listening to him describe all of this yesterday, it's obvious he's gotten to the place already where he believes and he understands the cognition of plants. But he has to build this base up. And that's really what he's saying with this paper. He's saying, let me show you all of the different elements where if we go down the path of studying the electrome, right, the overall electrical activity as how plants give attention, we can start to understand that this is the direction that's going to take us to a better understanding of how plants perceive and how plants take that perception and make cognitive decisions with it. And that's really what he's getting into. So I'm going to skip this part right now because this is the technical of exactly how we're getting into, like, for example, moreover, the learning levels by plant-plant or interspecies communication, and finally, responses to the variety of environmental stimuli surrounding plants can be improved. Finally, the modularity and non-centralized activities of plant organs in comparison to brain or cardiac integrated systems involving specialized cell are an additional argument in favor of the electrome as an overall unifying factor of bioelectric activity facing the sensorial flux that reaches plants when developing in constantly changing environments, right? basically what he's saying is, when I think about humans, we try to narrow into these centralized systems. When we think about animal development, so I look at the brain as the overall processing. I look at the cardiac system as processing other pieces. When instead, plants is looking at the overall electrical activity to understand the processing. The processing is happening across a wide range, but it's the electrical system itself that is the processing function, which is slightly different from the way we think about ourselves in the human. Yes, it's true that we use electrical systems in the human for passing information, but the processing of that information happens in certain centralized locations, at least as best as we understand. Where what they're saying here is that it is the electrical signaling itself, or the electrical activity itself, that is the processing of the system. So it is a very different way of looking at it. So let's jump through, because this is talking about, all of the different ways that the electrome, or what is the electrome, and how this all works. Different layers and such, which kind of goes back to what I was just explaining. So here we go. Taken together, these results show that electrical signals are a means of widespread communication within plants. The electron background activity, sustained by both cell-cell and long-distance signal transmission via the symplasmatic, phylomatic, so phylum-based, phylomatic continuum electrical interconnected network at the modular level, could act as a transducer that functions as a selective filter and diffuser, ensuring continuity and more efficient management of the environment at the whole plant level. The electron field could also support defense mechanisms even in non-injured regions involving glutamate-like receptor genes, triggering electrical signals and the activation of defense proteins far from the injury, as well as other hormonal or neurotransmitter-like dependent plant activities such as dopamine or phytoserotonin. In a broader sense, knowledge of the presence of a wide common repertory of ionic channels and a major gene families encoding both animal and plant main functions, and considering some cellular specificities such as proton pumps and cell walls for plants, as well as a probable common bacterial ancestor. It's not surprising that with respect to plant space-time reactivity, all of the basic functions of animal organisms are present in plants. Remember that. All of the basic functions of animal organisms are present in plants. For example, electrocoupling of ion transporters, as well as GLRs, that are homologous to the genes for mammalian inotropic glutamate receptors, were found in plants and could act as nonspecific amino acid sensors in wounding responses in plants' defense. Okay, moving on and moving forward, because now we're getting really, again, going into the technical. This is just the how to what it is that I just what I described. The emergent collective intelligent behaviors define plant evolutionary strategies and lead to form a type of cognition in the broad sense of the term, regardless of the criterion of cerebral or centralized information, but ensuring based on pluricentrality, modular organization, so pluricentrality, multiple central points, in spite of the sessile condition, extreme evolutionary success, since plants account for more than 80%, more than 96.7% with bacteria and fungi of the planet's biomass. By the way, that number at one point was 90%. Now we're down to 80. I just want that on the record. That says something about things. But anyway, in spite of sessile condition, extreme evolutionary success. Okay. This success is supported by the autotropic capacity of plants to continuously regenerate their own parts and an extensive panoply of sensory or sentient systems, embodied experience of the world, allowing them to elaborate developed communication strategies and complex social and intelligent behaviors. I'm reading that line again because these are the types of things that they're buried in here but they're so important. This success, so the success of plants accounting for more than 80% of the biomass, in other words, being able to be so adaptive, so connected, and so resilient is supported by the autotrophic, the fact that they can produce their own, they can produce their own food, they can take care of themselves, they are light eaters, capacity of plants to continuously regenerate their own parts. This is part of their success mechanism. So the non-centralized, we as human beings are very centralized, the non-centralized capabilities of plants to continuously regenerate their own parts and an extensive panoply of sensory or sentient systems, in which allows them to embody the experiences of the world, allowing them to elaborate developed communication strategies and complex social and intelligent behaviors. In other words, 470 million years of evolution, coupled with the incredible amount of species differentiation, coupled with more than 80% of biomass of our planet, is actually an extremely successful strategy for complex social and intelligent behavior, with resulting in extreme adaptability and resilience. Don't you think we can learn from that rather than thinking we're superior to it? Within this framework, a bottom-up reevaluation of the evolutionary processes leading to cognition and consciousness seem necessary. Considering the links between plastic and mesological interfaces seems to us to be a good way to approach plants as mesological plastic structures anchored in specific environment. The mesological perspective was broadly developed by Burke on the basis of von Uexküll's work. We've had to read about von Uexküll's work, and I couldn't pronounce it back then either. Differentiating the environment as raw and universal based on the local environment or milieu, forming a singular dynamic coupling with the living being, which is seen as a subject of the Vatsuyi, adding the specifically human notion of ecumene, that's the word, and structural moment of existence. More generally, mesology, also called the study or science of local environments, mesology, the study or science of local environments, something we're not so good at, can be assimilated into phenomenal ecology, where reality is neither objective nor subjective, but trajective. It frees itself from dualism and, according to Burke, raises an ontology. Plants had been little or not at all integrated into these modes of reasoning until then, in contrast to animals and humans. But they are excellent candidates for mesological perspectives, taking into account the mutual adequacy between a specific Umwelt, a location, a place in a given environment, and a species co-building a form of reality. Now, this is something that we have talked about multiple times, the idea that plants are very much an embodiment of simultaneously a member of the environment and actively constructing their environment, something that we, again, as humans, have pulled ourselves out of. And this gives us an opportunity to rethink about what that means. What does it mean for me to be simultaneously a part of the landscape in which I am in and actively constructing that landscape? We are always simultaneously in nature, observing nature, and a part of nature. These three things should never be decoupled, but we do it all the time. We think of ourselves as separately. And what we're saying is that because plants do not do that, they are always simultaneously a part of their environment as well as co-building that environment itself. Indeed, the sessile and autotrophic characteristics of plants raise the absolute necessity to adapt and have close links with the local environment. Plants are a part of this environment. These requirements involve a great deal of morphological, phenotypic, and epigenetic plasticity to adapt, transform, and grow, especially in hostile environments. Thus, apart from its essential role as a source of energy and the maintenance of ecosystems, the plant as an organism is, by excellence, a medial structure, inseparable link between an organic body and its environment. Let that sink in. And also a trajective structure, able to cross to go beyond one's own identity using bioelectricity as the main vector. I knew there was a reason I loved Souza. That and the fact that he, like, actively was arguing with somebody. I wished in some ways, unfortunately, we got to a point where they couldn't really argue well because we were doing everything in English, and Souza's Brazilian, so it means he wanted to do it in Portuguese. He couldn't find the words, and the other person he was arguing with was Italian and also somebody who struggled with words, and so they kind of a little bit resorted to insulting each other, but it was, I think, only because they could not come up with words. And if I knew Brazilian Portuguese, which I don't, I would have stepped in to translate a little bit more, like to translate, because I think if we would have given them both the opportunity to speak in their own language, it could have been much more interesting. Should have suggested we use Google Translate. Burke proposed an informal discussion on mesological plasticity following Debono's work on plant mesology, arguing that plasticity would be suited in the as that. In other words, the slash of mesological reaction, where at R equals SP, where R is the reality, is where R, the reality, is the subject S as a predicate P. And any individual or collective subject, human or non-human, is supposed to develop its own world. Where any individual or collective subject, human or non-human, is supposed to develop its own world. So our reality, the world I develop, is equal to subject over predicate. I need to write that down. This as that, where the plasticity fits naturally, incorporate the trajection, which gives meaning to this movement by which there is subjectivization of the environment and the environmentalism of the subject. If we follow this Burkean approach, this trajectory that can include P, P prime, or P double prime, predicates the following. 1, it is clearly distinguished the living from the machine and extends beyond subject-object dualism. 2, it establishes a causal and non-univocal relationship between the environment and behaviors, a cosmization of the body and a somatization of the world. This trajective plasticity added to the notion of subjecthood in place of subjectiveness as a proprioceptive or self-perceptive system with a certain degree of awareness or self-consciousness, allowing each living being to be subject rather than an object, offers answers to our questions about the sensitive and intelligent mode of the relationship established between the plant and the immediate environment. There is a lot to digest here. Now I understand why Souza's talk was a little bit like jumpy. It's just so much. This requires a whole day to get into itself. Okay, vegetal plasticity and the mesological perspective. This non-dualistic mesological perspective seems to us to be more realistic than a pure neurobiological or metaphorical positioning. Even if neuroid processes are clearly similar between animal and plant species, in fact, dynamic protoneural networks are operating at several systemic levels of plant bodies, such as roots, vascular, or meristem tissues. However, as we have already stated, proto means before the divergence of the evolutionary tree. So way back when, the presence of a common bacterial ancestor and of an ongoing reclassification of the phylogenetic trunks not clearly separating animals, symbiont, from plants, holobiont. Regardless, the plant electrome as a base bioelectric set of cellular and infracellular processes was effective long before neurons were born. And animal cells use the same biomolecular signaling configurations to construct, if not necessarily more complex, different worlds based on rapid motor skills and higher neural functions. And I think that this is something that's also important, right? What they're saying is What we're looking at is something that was common to all before the differentiation or the splitting of the tree, where plants being sessile continued to have this mechanism that then, of course, evolved in its own way. And animals having the need for motor skills because of the mobility developed this also neural centralized function. In other words, there was a common base that plants have evolved further on in and of itself, and animals instead have moved into a different direction, but that it all kind of comes from it. Next, behind the semantic and anthropocentric problems related by many authors to the extensive use of the term cognition, intelligence, or even consciousness for plants, we recognize a more pragmatic perspective considering the vegetal world as a complex biosystemic entity that is able to co-build the world, or a form of the world, or even a significant reality via a set of reciprocal, emerging, and confluent interactions. Adopting this position, we move away from metaphors or scientific interpretations to describe a modus operandi. Many living systems, or even artificial and cybernetic intelligence, would meet some of these criteria. However, none would show functional, phenotypic onto an epigenetic plasticity at the frontier between biophysical properties and evolutionary processes. It is therefore not a question of opposing dadaism or plasticism at the time of multiple interrogations on an artificial intelligences or cyber organization of society, but to benefit from their fruitful crossing, which will sooner or later demonstrate the singularity of the living. Wow, man. There's so much here that I'm trying to like digest in a quick format. This singularity is particularly illustrated in plants by what Natasha Myers, who you know I love Natasha Myers, called the phytoscene. And this is we've also done many of Natasha Myers' papers that are related to this. Go back through my commentary, so that you can get there. I've done several of her. I love her work, and the phytoscene is a very big element of what she calls herself a planthropologist for this reason. Or the space where these green beings have made this planet livable and breathable for animals like us. Lapping up sunlight, inhaling carbon dioxide, drinking in water, and releasing oxygen, plants literally make the world, she said. Which the truth of the matter is, in some ways, so do we. Because we inhale that oxygen and exhale that carbon dioxide. Now, it is true that plants could live without us because they have discovered ways, again, because they lap up sunlight, because they inhale this carbon dioxide, they put out this oxygen, but they also can reverse their breathing. So they don't need us while we need them. And I think this is the big piece that separates us. We have separated ourselves out from the world. Therefore, we can no longer survive of the world. Or is it to say we are surviving of the world where the plants are surviving from sunlight and they need sunlight in order to survive, and therefore we instead are partaking of the plant? Ooh, there's a lot to think about here. These considerations can be closer to the querying of Eleanor J. Gibson's eco-perceptual approach, focusing on the extraction of meaningful information from the environment for adaptation and development as the central concept for learning and development. Standing out from the discovery of J. Gibson, her more global approach of cognition is built on the spontaneous, active, and/or explorative perception. Affordances or possibilities for action for animals and behavioral hallmarks for humans of the surrounding world and on the grounding of perceptual knowledge. Perceptual learning is then described as a selective process using affordances or environmental configurations to extract relevant information from stimuli and improves with experience and growth. This mechanism engenders the development of perception action loops and new behaviors. While perception knowledge could be at the source of local representations, reasoning that can be applied to plants. Mesological plasticity is, in this context, not far removed from behavioral ecology, considering living organisms as interactive agents or subjects that are inseparable from environmental niches, which favors the perception action loop and fits well with our proposition of plants as electromic and cognitive mediated interfaces. Perceptually learning and information processes could then be issued from synchronized or distributed networks and or total dispatched bioelectric activity at the whole plant level. This function would undertake an efficient real-time filter of aerial environmental stimuli or stress tolerance via SOC behavior. That would be relayed by underground networks for the distribution of food and water, vegetal immunity, and or mutual exchanges with the mycorrhizal network connecting different species in a kind of wood wide web. Moreover, as stated by Belushka et al. Regarding the root apex transition zone and the historical Charles and Francis Darwin discovery of the anterior-posterior polarity of the higher plant body, the root apex transition zone, so root of a plant has the tip, and in here there is a part that acts as a, for lack of a better term, a neural network, which implies to Belushka and Mancuso's belief system that the distributed processing systems of plants are within the tip of the roots. In other words, that is where plants, to a certain extent, think. Let's just say it that way, which comes from also Darwin's observations, which is what we're talking about here, of brain-like root apices connected to the wood wide web. So in other words, the roots systems have a brain-like processing system which connects into mycorrhizal fungi networks so that we have this intelligent transfer of knowledge and of information and of other things that are happening through this root system into the fungal network, which then get distributed across the wood wide web that we hear talk about by, for example, Simard. So this is how all these different elements of research, and this is why I like Souza. Souza is looking at this on a wider range. Souza is taking Belushka's research, Natasha Meyer's researcher, Susan Simard's researcher, Darwin's research, and pulling all of these. You can see it from all the citations that are happening. We're going to even get into Galeano and Calvo and all of these that we have described. We've gone through all these multiple papers, so you can go back and pull them, and he's pulling these all together, and he's saying this is how they come together to show that if we think of a mesological approach, in other words, an approach of I am my environment and my environment is me. So I am in location and connected, and I am creating my reality based on the environment in which I'm in. I am so connected in, and I have a decentralized processing system that is moving through electrical neuron-like, hate using that term, but for a second, I'm going to bear with me, connections that not only work intra-species, in other words, inside of me, but also work interspecies where I connect into others. See why this is big? See why this is big? Okay. Only the brain-like root apices connect to the wood wide web of the mycorrhizal fungal network. It is interesting to note that on a different scale, the one covered by the plant electrome, remember all the signaling activity, plant fungi and bacteria-man symbiosis provides a good example of cooperative ensuring organic unity or individuality. Higher functions involving tree communication, mutualistic or defense strategies versus kudos, rhythmicity, excuse me, memory, immunity, or learning are indicators of the necessity for primitively located or relocated integration of pertinent information, i.e., for adaptation, advantages, survival, or territorial considerations. Recent papers, such as those of Calvo, which we studied, this 2016 paper, for phenoplasticity, Galliano et al., 2014 and 17, which we've done too, and Souza et al., for ecophysiological or behavioral ecology, support eco or mesological plasticity as a real challenge to prove the narrow relationships between plants and the environment, and to study the cognitive nature of plants as information patterns with specific languages. Souza et al. Recently discussed the nature of these assumptions, differentiating among the classical systemic approaches based on multi-scaled, self-organized, informational, or representational models from complex system theories of plant cognition. Correlates of plant intelligence and cognition. 4.1, plants as somatic and or inactive structures. Following the demonstration of the dynamic internal value system of associative learning, Galliano et al. And Galliano showed that selection should favor associative learning mechanisms that enables plants to distinguish whether and when cues are indicative of impending harmful or attractive conditions, and thus allowing them to take advantage of new resources to avoid novel threats. In this study, the author notes that this favoring is the case for internal representations of the present and the past and of the decision-making processes of animals, including their proper feelings or subjective state during the learning process. This favoring poses the problem of the vegetal subjectivity of the experience and of feelings of cognitive states motivating choices, she says. We agree with Galliano's position within the mesological acceptance of the subject during trajection, but with a different stance relative to plant cognition and interfaces that permit us to explore the emergence of minimal conscious states following Calvo's definition, or of somatically marked affective states relative to Damasio's work in the field of neuroscience. Indeed, it seems fundamental to us to examine the place of emotional states in decision-making process and somatic markers as initially defined by Damasio for brain cognitive processes. For him, the key idea and the hypothesis is that markers signal influence the processes of response multiple levels of operation, some of which occur overtly, consciously in mind, and some covertly, non-consciously in non-minded manner. The marker signals arise in bioregulatory processes, including those that express themselves in emotions and feelings, but are not necessarily confined to those alone. This is the reason why the markers are termed somatic. They relate to the body state structure and bioregulation, even when they do not arise in the body proper, but rather in the brain of the body. More recently, Damasio clearly differentiated emotions as being intrinsically linked to unconscious automated actions, programs of pure physical brain signals that are necessary for survival and many physiological processes. Whereas feelings, the perceptual take by the mind representing changes in the body, represent the outcome of the brain's interpretation of emotions and translate it into the fear or pleasure. Therefore, feelings are formed by and subsequent to emotions in animal and human brains that are constantly receiving signals from the body. Then, neural maps and somatosensory pathways recording emotional states from feelings. For Damasio and many neurobiologists, feelings are not possible without consciousness. And organisms can create feelings only when they are able to themselves represent their bodily functions. Moreover, I'm so curious as to where he's going to take this, because I know where I want to take it, but I'm so curious. Where am I? Moreover, consciousness derives from emotions and the body models the mind. Let us transpose this point of view to the problem of plant intelligence. There is no cerebral cortex, no mind, no brain, let alone prefrontal region, which is able to represent emotions or project action. Conversely, plants exhibit a sensitive and epidermal body that must handle a permanent stress to survive and adapt. Is there a need for consciousness and feelings in the human or no, in the animal or a human sense of the term? Certainly there is not. Considering plant intelligence in the light of phenomenological approaches such as those as Javon Wexkel, Gibson, or Maturana, which we have, and Varela, which we haven't talked about, Maturana and Varela's autopoiesis theory, which we have not gotten into. That's actually, I've never seen a paper on this that we never talked about. I need to, hold on, I'm making myself a note. I'm making myself a note because we have to talk about Maturana and Varela at some point, because if not, there's a lot of pieces that are missing without going in there. Seems to us to be more pertinent, taking into account the nature of consciousness and the necessity for all living things to adapt and develop in a stressful environment. Perception, action, loop, and pragmatic definition of plant intelligence as a problem-solving process, as proposed by Trewavas. He doesn't say it, okay? But I'm going to say it. Listen to, this is a whole paragraph to like read over and over again, because what he's saying without saying is, look, when you look at it, using the way that we're thinking about it for plants, where we keep saying it's not important for deceptive systems, which plants are, they can deceive, for systems that adapt in this way to have consciousness. But if you use that definition, there's no need for animals or plants to be conscious either. And yet we are. So if we are, even though we don't need to, is it possible that plants are, even though according to you, they don't need to? I can say this because I don't rely on academic funding. An intelligent emotional environment for plants? Our hypothesis would be that in these frameworks, that species-specific Umwelt were enacted throughout evolution, and that embodied cognitive or minimally conscious structures must have access to this vital experience to preserve their integrity and subsequently to grow in their immediate environment. It's a very polite way of saying what I just said. This phenomenon is observed in the case of paramecia insects or bacteria following Damasio, and recent studies have demonstrated the capacity of intestinal bacteria to directly act at the level of human behavior or memory. However, we must clearly differentiate the ability to carry a prefiguration of the world and emotive processes having a biochemical counterpart, such as the perception of danger and the need to survive under stressful conditions, and the associated feelings. It concerns emotions, the physical substrate, without feelings, mental representation of the body. In those cases, while for more evolved organisms such as mammals or birds, feelings of emotions are possible, but without consciousness of them, i.e., no means to think about what they experience. How do we know that? Sorry, I need to take a minute because I get so frustrated when I see when we just I get really, 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 really frustrated with the concept that because we don't see introspection in the way that we see in humans and in primates, in other species, we assume that it doesn't exist. I never see in these papers, I don't know if never is not the right word, but probably almost never see in these papers ones that state, we don't know what introspection looks like. How do we not know? With plants sitting in front of us for hours at a time, how do we not know? I mean, how do we know whether or not they are contemplating their environments? We have no way of knowing. Not from traditional science right now. We don't have a measurement because Our measurements for introspection and for consciousness are based on human understandings of it. So how could we know? How could we know? It just it's very frustrating to me. Okay. Okay, where are we? In those cases, well, for let's see, it concerns emotions, the physical substrate, without feelings, mental representation of the body. In those cases, while for more evolved organisms, I'm not even going to go there, but with such as mammals or birds, feelings of emotions are possible, but without consciousness of them, i.e., no means to think about what they experience. In contrast to primates and humans, which exhibit introspective consciousness and or mental imagery. Again, we have no way of knowing whether or not birds or any other kind of mammal or any other kind of animal in general or bacteria or plants are actually experiencing that, because they could be experiencing introspection in a completely different way. And anybody who does any kind of plant communication or animal communication knows that there's introspection. Following this reasoning, plants could be considered as primitive sensory and or somatic markers that are able, like bacteria, to use embodied perception signals as markers to launch perception action processes. This report describes the first time, to the best of our knowledge, that this point is evoked or discussed about plants. As we stated before, physiological emotions are the behavioral expression of singular brain-body unities and must be differentiated from feelings. Hold on, I'm thinking about this. Physiological emotions are the behavioral expression of singular brain-body unities and must be differentiated from feelings. So this is the pluralist place. Emotions are physiological responses. So I feel pain. So somebody pricks my finger and I feel pain. My body reacts because there's a pain. That is an emotion. And a feeling is an introspective understanding of what that means. Okay, I'm getting this definition. Not agreeing with the fact, but whatever. Let's move on. The body as a theater of emotions is, in Damasio's theory, an essential notion to consider for survival and adaptation during evolution. Such emotional behaviors are linked to the development of a body-world interaction involving a homeostatic scheme rooted in evolution since the eubacteria, i.e., bodily manifestations that are essential to survival, development, and build an intelligible world around oneself. In the most evolved species, this scheme has evolved into an image or body-brain mapping involved in all our behaviors, including seemingly more rational decision-making. Therefore, emotions could be the first form of intelligence of the living and thus must apply to plants. Okay, at least this is a step forward. They're saying because the emotions are these physiological or somatic responses, let's not say physiological, somatic responses, therefore they must apply to everyone, not necessarily feelings. Now I have the song Feelings in my head. Feelings, nothing more than sorry. Within this specific definition of a cognitive state involving communication strategies to survive and a well-being, there is a clear differentiation from the sentimental continuity of the body that we perceive at the animal or human scale, leading to body awareness and either decision or creative marking. The dimensions of the sensitivity for one hand and, in contrast, of sentience and private mental experience could then exemplify at one end the perception action loop and at the other end the boundary between emotions and feelings, self, outside intentionality. Unicellular and ubiquitous organisms such as bacteria or microorganisms with or without photosynthetic capacity have colonized all environments, including within other living beings, establishing different types of associations, from pathogenic to symbiotic, demonstrating a high sensitivity to the environment and ability to project actions according to the affective or emotional environment in which they evolve. Similarly, plants shall be considered as embodied cognitive structures with access to physiological emotions and enactive states anchored in a singular environment without either feelings or mental representations or self-consciousness. We must imagine other forms of intelligence, other forms of cognition using many pre-neural assets that have evolved differently. This is a sentence I can get behind. We must imagine other forms of intelligence, other forms of cognition using many pre-neural assets. So when there was a common denominator that have evolved through different channels. So this goes very much to the paper from last week of broadening the definition of a central nervous system in order to understand that there could have been multiple types of evolutions of that service system. The otherness of plants. Such plant otherness is based on both a highly sensitive bioelectric plastic interface, allowing plants to be aware of the world, and a complex interconnected metabolic apparatus that builds up biochemical representations, enabling memory and learning processes. And it could have a self-reflection that is not the same as ours. Can it not? Can it not? Hold on, I just want to see how far this goes. I don't know what page technically this thing thinks we're in. Just to know. Okay. We're almost at the end. We've got these 2.5 pages to go. Okay. Perception binding in plants. Another hypothesis concerning the correlates of plant intelligence applies to the working hypothesis of perceptual binding in neurocognition. Although it does not use the same scheme, i.e., the neuronal encoding part of a detected subject reconstructed by cortical pathways. The initial PB hypothesis concerned the visual manual coordination requiring a dynamic linking of perceptual information and sensory motor control of the action, implying multimodal spatial representations. So basic neural activity sequentially distributed in the primary visual cortex. Spatiotemporal relations between individual neurons co-activated by the same object, and conversely, neural activities induced by several objects were determined, defining the sensory modes that are activated by the synchronous reconstruction of a picture. However, if several neuroscientists link the perceptual binding to brain synchrony, they wonder about the perceptual awareness, and some argue that the phenomenon could be limited to local synchronization. Following these assumptions, we suggest that plants could use perceptual binding as an operative mode through plasticity complexes to detect their immediate environment without a nervous system, or without a central nervous system as defined by the mechanistic definition of an animal nervous system. Let's be a little bit more clear. Doesn't mean they don't have a kind of nervous system. It just means they don't have the same kind of nervous system. But this is part of the semantics that we're still arguing, which is really annoying. Thus, without the need to integrate or represent it, but with the ability to locally bind or synchronize, deploying behaviors that are adapted to their survival or well-being. In fact, the perceptual loop in the plant-environment relationship includes plant proprioception. It's whole proprioception, self-awareness thing. Self-awareness of the physical, driving both growth processes and body shaping development. Some studies adopting a quantum and/or fractal perspective consider the importance of microtubule-associated proteins in memory, learning, or conscious processes at the level of plants, as in animals. Prototypical gamma waves and the conduction of electrical currents via microtubules are evoked in this context. Could we perhaps look for such oscillatory signals or gamma synchrony that could be displayed at the level of dynamic plant networks as a sign of perceptual binding, learning, or awareness? Such universals, such as electricity or gravity, are indeed common to all living things and constitute a strong scientific argument in this reevaluation process. We suggest that experimental evidence of the status of perceiving or accumulating knowledge will come from a better understanding of the electrome scope. Indeed, if, on one hand, such words as learning or intelligence meet precise definitions, they will, on the other hand, be subject to interpretation. Only unmistakable experimental facts will be able to validate concepts or a linguistic corpus, even a metaphorical one. which has until now been exclusive to wired brains, which we should remove because there are other forms of intelligence. A flat EEG sign is the sign of brain death in humans, while the continuous production of bioelectric energy distributed at all scales of the living organism is the sign of its vitality. These bases are common to all biological organisms. We are concerned with what they represent at the scale of the relationship life of each species in its own environment. If these functions are known for most animals and humans, it is likely that in the plant realm, mainly based on cellular, endocellular, and regenerative activities, spontaneous low voltage activity at the whole plant level must be meaningful in an ectophysiological context. In this paper, we want to address this issue by focusing on electrome signals as discriminatory SOC behavior, in which patterns are analyzable by machine learning techniques or intervallar arithmetic for a plant in a given environment condition. One of the consequences of this validation concerns its cognitive and epistemic nature, which is the point that we are currently addressing. Transdisciplinary cross-pollinizing approach to plant cognition. Common language to design cognitive and intelligent behaviors. Before discussing the emerging plant cognition field of research and to anchor the rule of the electrome in this field, we need to focus our attention on the impact of the terminology used. Since the ratio of metaphoric versus real, operational or productive state could have excellent stimulating properties, but also lead to abusive categorizations. For instance, everyone agrees that plants do not have brains. We can agree with that. I can agree with that. And Darwin's brain hypothesis does not induce false interpretations, whereas the over-neuronization of plants could lead to detachment from the true nature of the plant kinome. For instance, in the wake of the quest for cognition and of the salutary revolution caused by the paradigm of plant neurobiology, the metaphorical and provocative aspects of which were claimed by its peers hit home. The use of the term synapse, meaning contact or junction, a synapse, can certainly be applied to plants following Belushka's fundamental discoveries of the brain-like behavior of root apices. This is that whole, what I was talking about earlier, right? The apex transition zone, the fact that there is a electrical transition that happens there, a synapse that fires an electrical signal that passes, and therefore Belushka says this root apex has a behavior that is neural-like. However, its use will remain forever attached to Sherrington's 1906 findings about neurons. Similarly, the recent use by Calvo et al., by the way, I'm almost positive that every time they reference garçon and they reference Calvo is actually the same person. Because, which is weird, because Souza should know this, because Souza is Mais Souza, as in they have two last names. And so, but he uses Souza, not Mais, as opposed to Calvo, which uses Calvo, which is Calvo's garçon. Anyways, it's just this thing. They're the same person, by the way. Of the term phytoneurology, also referring to Bose, this is J.C. Bose, so J. Chandra Bose, pioneering work on the nervous system of plants back at the turn of the century, which may find historical legitimacy therein, loses accuracy because neurology is well known to be a medical discipline that is strictly related to the human or animal brain. The same reasoning can be applied for the extensive use of the term intelligence, which may refer to intelligent behaviors and may refer to a system of value indexed on the animal IQ. Moreover, vocabulary related to the mind of plants, like mental capacities or consciousness, based on their abilities to acquire, learn, transmit, and make decisions, Michael Hall, can be relativized or used in precise experimental and/or contextual conditions. For us, even if this approach is philosophically admissible or compatible, and it can provide some ethical interesting questions regarding the plant realm, speaking of plant minds or consciousness is not an adequate vocabulary and could be a counterproductive proposition. This is an interesting argument that he actually made in the conference yesterday. Very different from Balushka, who is much more adept to reconquering. I'm going to say conquering because it's the right word in this case, to reconquer words and to give them a more generic representation that can apply to any kingdom or kinhome, where instead Souza says, can we stop arguing by just coming up with other words, separate but equal to a certain extent? I don't know how I feel about this. There's a part of me that would like, similar to the paper from last week where we talked about broadening the nervous system, and where if we can give a definition to what nervous system is that takes out the mechanistic approach and instead talk about what is the function. For example, the function of intelligence, the function of consciousness, the function of cognition, and therefore then define animal cognition, human cognition, plant cognition, bacterial cognition, all of these different aspects. I actually think this could be, I think that could be much more interesting. That's my personal approach. So unless we dehumanize or completely redefine the term, I just noticed that, hold on a second. I just noticed that my connection is unstable. And I don't understand why, because I have a full signal connection. So give me a sec, because I want to understand that. There we go. Okay, it should be better now. Okay. So going back to where I was talking about, I don't know. I see Souza's approach. I don't know how I feel about it. I need to think about it. Unless we dehumanize or completely redefine the term, speaking of mentality involves a thinking brain. Not sure I agree. Mental representations and intentions, which is far from the case for plant cognition, even considering the capacity of plants to make decision. How do you know? We don't know intentionality. This is still the undiscovered or under-researched area, intentionality. Although we know that there's intentionality. We just don't understand the mechanism of intentionality. Let me say it this way, because many of the papers that were presented all showed intentionality. We just don't know the mechanism. So thus we propose the best way to qualify without overestimating such perceptual, sensorial, cognitive, and communicative abilities is to explore them in the field of an ecosystemology, or plasticity of living systems. In this framework, each organism can thus have similar intelligent behaviors, but different forms of intelligibility or cognitive access to experience. New inter- or transspecies cultures could arise from these considerations, where each living being would have its own apprehension of the surrounding world without being obliged to define its functions from the humanoid language, and where new languages concerning the human-plant interactions could be born. It is indeed necessary to clarify exactly what underlies the term cognition, intelligence, sentience, or consciousness. I love how consciousness is always in quotes. For the vegetal kingdom or kinhome, and find a common language to designate plant cognitive abilities with regard to animals and humans, ranging from the capacity to establish sensory motor coordination, or to the ability to reason, problem solve, or for symbolic thought, or form. I think there's an M missing there. Form symbolic thought. 5.2, developing a core TD biosemantic approach of plants. The initial plant intelligence field and plant neurobiology were an open door to redefine, using a scientific approach, the plant metabolic, behavioral, and signaling pathways. In this wake, a large number of studies have shown the common action mechanisms of animals and plants at the cellular level: long-distance electrical signaling, vesicular transport of neuroactive substances, and so forth, and the integration, storage, and transfer capabilities of plant information. These works have evolved in different directions, ranging from philosophical or phenomenological questions on mental states or the sentience of plants, to experimental studies on excitable tissue networks, phenotypic plasticity, memory, or associative learning. In this direction, to consider the plastic interfaces, PBEs, as a basic framework and mesological link to the milieu or to the GSRs, non-linearly conducting to cognitive functions and complex behaviors would be a more realistic and operative model for the study of plants. In fact, common sensory networks would have been used both cognitive and non-cognitive entities during evolution, and then stabilized as metaplastic specific processes, giving birth to different degrees of cognitive or conscious processes, from access to experience without representation to phenomenal and introspective consciousness. In this way, self-organized and knowledge-accumulating systems, such as plants, may have developed adaptive behavior, minimal and/or embodied cognition, following the animal sensor-motor coordination perspective, differentiating free-moving versus self-induced motility for Garthon and Kaiser. Kaiser, yeah. Interactive cognition, developmental changes, plant decision-making, and invertebrate plant interactions for chihuahuas and associated learning. Let us now consider plant ecoplasticity and electromic interfaces that can drive emergent intelligent behaviors from permanent low-voltage spontaneous electrical networks. I feel like he keeps building things up and then breaking them down, and then builds them up and then breaks them down. The working hypothesis related to their ability to maintain a functional watch and to communicate extensively with their local and global environment must be studied in a transdisciplinary manner. This is a prerequisite since cognitive process or plant intelligence are aimed at the plasticity of the living and should not be criteria linked to a top-down view of evolutionary phenomena. Only a TD approach among several fields of knowledge and/or competences is able to apprehend such transverse questioning. Such an approach, broadly developed by several current thoughts in Europe, aimed to defend through a manifesto an attitude that takes into account the difference between inter, and transdisciplinary, the latter being considered by the French school as the ability to cross and go beyond disciplines. Yeah, I use transdisciplinary all the time. Anyway, without denying his own. We then would anticipate a bottom-up reevaluation of the current notions of intelligence, memory, cognitions, and consciousness. Ooh, he didn't put consciousness in quotes here. And perhaps the gradual birth of a new paradigm considering the plastic code of life. Our electromic and ecosystemic view of plasticity of living systems clearly requires the development of a research area with a developing core TD and plant biosemantics that would go hand in hand with the study of plant intelligence and cognition. Such a program, rather than staying focused on their neuron-like properties only, could anchor plant cognition on the basis of the following. 1. The recognition of the real efficiency of the electrome at the level of any living self-organized bioelectrical system. 2, the qualification of plants as unique plastic interfaces between a given environment and a singular milieu or habitat. 3, the metaplastic scope of their intra and interspecies intelligent communication strategies. These 3 criteria, coupled with the specificities of plants, such as their autotrophy, sessility, or modularity, can explain about all their complex behaviors, particularly their necessity to develop early sensory processing, access to experience, integrating networks linked to memory, self-acquaintance, learning, information processing, and at a minimal and/or embodied cognition to survive and then to develop. In this context, each considered criteria might explain a whole section of the history of the metadiscipline, biology first, ectoplasticity second, and intelligence, including cognitive and inactive processes, third. As an example in the biological field, the wide use of the same support, e.g. ionic channels, action potentials and all this. In bacteria, nematodes, plants, animals, and humans are, as shown by the pioneering work of Burdon Sanderson and Bose, and currently by many plant electrophysiologists, allow us to consider the electrome as the referent biosystem for all communicative beings, as the genome is for referent for genetic studies. Okay, this is interesting because now we're getting to it. Basically, he's saying one of the common denominators across every field that can help us understand that these are communicative, these are beings that communicate and therefore probably have some definition of intelligence, some definition of memory, some definition of all these other terms, is the fact that there is this electrome, so this electrical activity that's happening, just the same as when we think about the genome for all of the genetic representation that we have, regardless of what is inside of the genome. A recent paper by Balushka and Miller focused on a new entity named the senome, representing all transmembrane sensory flow and their expression in terms of memory and cellular cognition. The senome completes the ternary genome epigenome model and allows one to embrace the complexity of the living and its protostates from the simplest unicell levels. Interestingly, the authors describe a direct dynamic coupling between the sensome and the electrome, representing the bioelectrical fields in the elaboration of all multicellular behavior and future social cognition. The second criterion involves electrophysiology and mesological plasticity, i.e., the ability of living systems to evolve intelligently in the Trowava sense in a given space. So ecophysiology and mesological. So I can evolve, I can adapt in as well as adapt my physical location and space where I'm at. It implies several kinds of perceptive cognitive processes, the development strategies, or even consciousness in the sense of awareness, including proprioception and the ability to self-discriminate from other individuals. Finally, a third criterion will open a new field in cognitive sciences, integrating the extensive communication of plants. These are the concluding remarks. Previous studies have demonstrated the major role played by macroscopic spontaneous low voltage variation potentials in any meaningful treatment of real-time information by plants. This organic matrix, supported by self-organized criticality and spike-like activities, is supposed to filter and regulate the constant flow of stimuli and stress managed by the perceptive systems of plants embedded in their environment. The resulting complex self-organized electrome, and the activity of which is classifiable, is composed of several activity subtypes, such as changes in membrane potentials, bioelectrical fields, synchronized propagated action potentials, systolic calcium 2 mediated signals. We consider that the ground anchoring and organic modularity, but electromediated plasticity unity makes plants good candidates as embodied cognitive organisms or inactive structures that interact permanently with a stressful and changing environment. This position may answer several questions regarding plant cognition and intelligent behavior. One, the common homeostatic behavior of all living systems, optimizing their survival and well-being. Two, the major phenotypic and epigenetic plasticity shown by plants. Three, their peculiar role as perceptual electromic plastic interfaces. Four, their trajecting character involving mesological plasticity. And five, their complex treatment of information flows, including learning and memory processes with an as yet unidentified integration center. Do they have to have an integration center? 6, their unity or individuality, despite modular or non-unitary organicity. I like that. Their unity or individuality, and this was actually something that came up also in this conference. The idea of plant personalities. Ooh, man, I'm looking forward to more research on that too. As previously stated, we strongly suggest that, despite or because of their modular or sessile in nature, plants have developed during evolution cognitive functions through the nonlinear dynamics of the electrome synchronized or distributed networks. Rapid changes and learning are indeed associated with the ability to filter and respond to incessant stimuli from the environment, including stress management and the development of complex behaviors within the electromic and ecosystemic paradigm that we support. Cognition could then be assimilated into a universal dynamic living process that is used by evolution to progress and survive, not necessarily needing neural or anthropocentric considerations. This is an important piece of it. We suggest that plant PIs use perceptual and or cognitive abilities as well as neural-like properties through the electrome as a main vector to develop or learn new behaviors. This hypothesis completely fits into the new cognitive and behavioral fields, integrating extended cognitive meanings. And now, with our new proposition, the mesological plasticity, considering plants as active agents presenting inactive behaviors with medial and or trajective trajectories. The general cognitive model proposed by Souza et al. For the integration of local and global new behaviors includes a feedback in and or feedback out. This model supports our position involving biosemantics and associative learning, but also autopoiesis, which they never talk about. They never get into details, and yet just throw it out there. Maturana and Varela, they say it again, and phenomenology of experience or attention. If the enacting process developed by Varela is clearly identified today, the phenomenological model of attention in plants described by Martyr, which is what the definition I gave you at the very beginning, reveals, despite their differences, criteria that are similar to animal or human behaviors. For the author, plant thinking is a non-cognitive and non-representational mode of thinking proper to plants, and we should consider phytophenomenology as a new field to understand the real intelligence of plants. So this is very similar to Martyr's approach. Martyr's approach is plants are intelligent in their own way. Plants do a bunch of things in their own way, and we should not use human definitions to try to explain plants. The key concept, and as a matter of fact, by doing and trying to imply human definitions, we dumb down plants. And we should consider, the key concepts to integrate here is the dispersion of plant intentionality in vegetal sentience and bioattention, the spatial and temporal construction of the plant world through a network of dispersed intentionalities, the appropriateness of modular development to the dispersion, and finally, plant co-intentionality and clashing intentionality as theoretical descriptions of communication, kin recognition, and cross-species, cross-kinhomes interactions. Phytophenomenology, integrating the otherness of plants, could be, in this context, the counterpart of the neurophenomenological current in neurosciences. To conclude, mesological plasticity could act as the potential basis of plant unitary cognition and or dispersive functions, knowing that learning and memory processes improve adaptive reactivity, survival, and plant fitness in a changing environment, nevertheless sustaining the individual unique ecosystem. We suggest to consider the electrical dimension of plants following this new reading grid, i.e., considering plants' electromic plasticity interfaces as and inactive access to cognition, and the co-construction of a mesologically mediated world. So really thinking about this from the perspective of plants' electromic systems, so the electrical activity, is what gives us access to cognition, which we have to construct as I am both my environment and actively creating my environment. So I'm reacting to the environment and creating the environment. And this methodologically mediated world gives me the ability to understand and read my environment differently. In other words, this is what cognition is for plants, not whatever it is for humans or other animals. Considering in our electronic reading grid of such interactive ecosystems, using mainly EPG activities as discriminatory windows to treat and react in real time to the permanent sensorial flux assaulting plants would be a crucial step in the comprehension of the cognitive nature of plants and of the dynamic processes sustaining the plasticity of living systems. Wow, man, there is a lot here to take in. So much. So much to take in, but I get it. And this is one of those, the reason this paper is so dense, the reason this paper is so hard. Hold on, let me get to the top of it. I'm still getting there. I'll get there. Give me a sec. The reason this paper is so dense, so difficult in some aspects to get to is because this is the type of paradigm shifting paper that we're looking for, right? This is a paper that does not rely on the current definitions that exist in some ways, although of course you have to reference some of them. But what this paper is trying to do is get us to understand a new approach to looking and understanding as plants as cognitive beings that does not rely on comparing and contrast to humans, but instead takes a common approach that all beings, we can assume, going back 400 and, actually probably going back like 300,000 years, we can look at these common approaches that then differentiate it off. There's a lot here. So I'm going to stop now because there's a lot here. And I'm going to give you time to process this because I need time to process this. As you know, I don't read these beforehand. So there is a lot to process. And therefore, look at that. This is what happens when your hair is up in this way. So there is a lot to process. Hold on. I'm like, anyway, there's a lot to process. I need to think about this. I need to think about this a lot because there's a lot of pieces here. I do appreciate, and this is what I liked about Souza when he was describing it, he's not afraid to say, we need a different approach. We keep using the old approach. It doesn't work. We need to think about a different approach. And I am attempting to use the electrical signaling world as that approach. And from there, we can study it as something in and of itself rather than just comparing to what human neurobiological responses are going. So it's completely looking at it from a different perspective. But I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. So what do you think about this? Like, how do you see this as connecting in? Do you see this as important at all to understand our plants in this way? Is it important? Or should we try to redefine the human animal terms or develop new terminology and new accesses in and of itself? I want to know what your thoughts are because there's just, again, there's so much here to process. And I feel like we're going to now start to get into the breakdown of what this means. Like I said, this paper came out in 2019. I just saw Souza, and he is barely touching the surface of this. So we are really at the very beginning. He is focusing on attention and looking at that from an electron perspective, like what is the electrical response connected to attention, to try to understand what is the, in his case, he would say emotions passing through the plant, which are motor sensory, like what goes into somatic responses at this point, because again, he's trying to stay away from feelings, which he feels right now are connected only to certain types of species. But what do you think? right? So please leave me a comment. This is the place to have that discussion, or you can come into the Naturally Conscious community, which of course is in the description, and you can find and get access to the Naturally Conscious community where we will also be having this discussion. But now it's time to close this session because I don't even think I can think anymore. So remember, resist the urge to hold back your emerging green billions. Now, next week, we will not be having a Friday session because we have the final discussion in the Plant Wisdom Book Club. And in the Plant Wisdom Book Club happens at the same time, the final discussion. And so no plant consciousness commentary coming then. But we will find a time to meet. And if not, we'll see each other in 2 weeks. Until then, this is me, Tigrea Gardenia. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to seeing you next time. That's it for me. Bye.